The forest floor cracked under Elena's bare feet as she ran, branches slicing across her arms, her heart slamming against her ribs like it wanted to break free before the guards caught up to her. Behind her, torches bobbed between the trees, and she could hear the deep, furious voice of Damien calling her name across the valley, a sound that used to make her feel safe and now made her blood run cold. She had one chance, one narrow gap in the wards where the old magic thinned, a place she had found weeks earlier while pretending to gather herbs for the healer. If she reached it before the guards closed the distance, she would be free. If she did not, she would spend the rest of her life locked behind gates of gold, admired and adored and utterly trapped. The moon hung heavy and red above the treetops, the kind of moon that made every wolf in the territory restless. Tonight of all nights, the pack was gathered at the great hall for the blood moon rites, their attention pulled toward fire and ritual and song. It was the one night Elena had been waiting for, the one night the king's guard might be thin enough to slip through. She had planned this for months. Every stolen moment in the library, every quiet conversation with the old herbalist who still remembered a world before the Alpha King's rule, had led to this single sprint through the dark. She carried nothing but a small pouch tied to her hip, a charm inside it that dulled her scent, bought from a traveling trader who did not ask questions. A branch snapped somewhere close behind her, and she flinched, nearly losing her footing on the slick ground. She did not turn to look. Looking back had never done her any good. Not once in the 2 years she had lived inside the walls of Damien's court, watched and guarded and treated like something precious and breakable all at once. He had never hurt her. That was the strange, twisted truth of it. Damien, the Alpha King, feared by every pack for 100 miles, had never once raised his hand against her. He had given her silk dresses and warm rooms and food fit for royalty, but none of it had been a choice. She had been brought to his court after her own pack was destroyed, and though he called her his guest, everyone else called her his prisoner, and after 2 years, Elena had started to believe them. She pushed harder, her lungs burning, the cold night air stinging her throat. The trees began to thin ahead of her, the ward line only a few 100 feet away now, marked by nothing more than a subtle shimmer in the air that most eyes would never notice. She had trained herself to see it after weeks of watching the boundary at dusk. "Elena!" The voice was closer now, raw and desperate in a way she had never heard from him before. Damien's voice usually carried command, absolute and unshakable, the voice of a man who never doubted he would be obeyed. Tonight it cracked in the middle of her name, and for one terrible second she almost stopped running. She did not stop. The shimmer in the air grew closer, and she reached into her pouch for the charm, closing her fingers around the small stone the trader had given her. It pulsed warm against her palm, a sign it was working, masking her scent from the wolves who would otherwise track her by smell alone. She did not know if it would be enough. She only knew she had no other option left. Behind her, the guards had multiplied. She could hear at least 4 sets of footsteps now, crashing through the undergrowth, and beneath them, a lower sound, a growl that vibrated through the ground itself. Damien had shifted. She had never seen him in his wolf form up close, only from a distance during ceremonies, a massive black shape twice the size of any other wolf in the pack. The sound of his growl now, closing in behind her, made her stomach twist with a fear she had spent 2 years trying to bury. She reached the ward line and did not slow down. The shimmer parted around her like water breaking against a stone, a strange pressure sweeping over her skin, and then she was through, stumbling onto the other side, gasping, her legs shaking beneath her. She turned, just once, and saw the massive black wolf skid to a halt at the boundary, unable to cross. His golden eyes locked on hers through the dark. He did not look like a king in that moment. He looked like a man watching something he loved disappear and knowing there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elena turned and ran again, deeper into the unfamiliar forest beyond the wards, tears streaming down her face, though she could not have said whether they came from fear or grief, or the strange, aching relief of finally being free. She did not look back a second time. She could not afford to. For 3 days, she moved through unfamiliar territory, sleeping in hollow trees and drinking from streams, surviving on berries and the last of the dried meat she had hidden in her pouch. She avoided roads and villages, terrified that word of her escape would have already spread, that every human town for 100 miles would be watched by the king's men. On the 4th day, exhausted and half-starved, she stumbled into a small human settlement far from any pack territory she recognized. She told them her name was Nora, a name she chose on the spot, simple and forgettable, nothing like the name that had once been announced at royal feasts. She found work in a tavern kitchen, scrubbing pots for scraps of food and a place to sleep in the storeroom. She thought, in those early days, that the hardest part was behind her. She had escaped. She had survived the run through the forest, the days without food, the fear of being caught. What she did not yet understand was that leaving Damien's court was only the first of many battles she would have to fight, and that the years ahead would demand a different kind of courage than the one that had carried her through the trees that night. Word did reach her, eventually, carried by traveling merchants who spoke in hushed voices about the Alpha King who had torn apart half the forest, searching for something he refused to name. They said he had not slept properly in weeks. They said his temper had grown so fierce that even his most loyal commanders avoided him when the topic of the search came up. Elena listened to these stories with her head down, scrubbing pots harder than necessary, saying nothing. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that whatever grief he carried was nothing compared to the 2 years she had spent as a beautiful, well-kept prisoner, watched every hour of every day, never once given the choice to leave on her own terms. She told herself this so many times that some nights she almost believed it. But there were other nights, quieter ones, when she lay awake in the storeroom listening to the creak of the old tavern settling around her, and she remembered the way Damien used to bring her books from villages 3 days' ride away because she had once mentioned enjoying stories. She remembered the way he had once sat with her for hours after a nightmare, not touching her, not speaking much, simply present, as though his presence alone could keep the dark away. She remembered these things and hated herself a little for missing them. The search for her continued for nearly 2 months before the stories began to change. Merchants no longer spoke of the king tearing apart the forest. Instead, they spoke of a king who had grown cold and distant, who ruled with efficiency but without warmth, who had stopped attending festivals and celebrations that did not require his presence. They said he kept a room in his manor that no one was permitted to enter, and that every night, without fail, he visited it alone. Elena moved on from the tavern before anyone could grow too curious about the quiet girl who flinched at loud noises and avoided anyone who asked too many questions about her past. She traveled further from pack territory than she had ever been, deep into human cities where the scent of thousands of people made it nearly impossible for any wolf to track a single trail among the crowd. She found work as a seamstress, then later as a cook, then as a laundress, moving from job to job whenever she felt eyes lingering too long or questions cutting too close to truths she could not afford to share. She learned to suppress the wolf inside her almost entirely, going months at a time without shifting, afraid that even a single run through open country might leave a trail that could somehow, impossibly, find its way back to the king who had once called her his. She learned to walk with her head down in crowds, to speak little, to make herself as forgettable as possible. She became very good at disappearing. 5 years passed this way, each one blending into the next, marked mostly by the changing of seasons and the slow accumulation of coins saved and saved again. Elena grew from a frightened girl of 19 into a woman who had learned, through hard necessity, how to survive entirely on her own. She was proud of that, in a quiet way, even as the loneliness of it settled into her bones like a permanent ache. She thought about Damien less often as the years passed, though he never fully left her mind. Sometimes, in the space between waking and sleeping, she would catch herself remembering the sound of his laugh, rare and unguarded, or the particular way he used to look at her across a crowded room, as though nothing else in it existed. She would push these memories away as soon as she noticed them, annoyed at herself for the softness that still lingered somewhere beneath 5 years of careful distance. By the time the 5th year came to a close, Elena had settled in a modest town on the edge of a territory she did not recognize, working long hours at a small inn for barely enough coin to cover her rent and food. Winter was approaching, and with it, the kind of desperation that came from watching her savings shrink faster than she could replace them. She needed steady work, something that paid better than the inn, something that would let her save enough to eventually move somewhere warmer, somewhere with more opportunity. It was in this state of quiet desperation that she heard about a position opening at a grand manor on the outskirts of town, a household in need of additional staff before the winter season began. The pay was better than anything she had earned in years. The work was steady. The manor, according to the woman who told her about it, belonged to a powerful local family, though she did not know much more than that. Elena told herself it did not matter whose manor it was. She needed the work, and a household staff position meant steady meals, a room of her own, and wages she could actually save. She spent the evening mending her one good dress, preparing to present herself the next morning as a capable, hard-working woman who deserved the position. She did not know, as she fell asleep that night, exhausted and hopeful in equal measure, that the manor she planned to visit belonged to a name she had spent 5 years trying to forget. She did not know that the powerful local family the woman had mentioned so casually was in fact the very court she had once fled through a moonlit forest, torches burning behind her and a king's desperate voice calling her name into the dark. She woke before dawn, dressed carefully, and set out along the frost-covered road toward the manor, her breath fogging in the cold morning air, entirely unaware that she was walking directly back into the life she had run so far to escape. The manor rose out of the frost like something carved from a memory Elena had spent 5 years trying to bury. She stopped walking the moment she saw the iron gates at the end of the long drive, her breath catching painfully in her chest. The stonework was different, newer wings added to the east and west, since she had last seen it, but the bones of the place were unmistakable. She knew those gates. She had once been carried through them, half-conscious, after her own pack had fallen, brought here as a girl with nowhere else to go. For one long moment, she considered turning around and walking straight back into town, forgetting the position, forgetting the wages, finding some other way to survive the winter. But her savings were thin, and the cold was coming fast, and 5 years of hard survival had taught her that fear alone was rarely a good enough reason to walk away from an opportunity she desperately needed. She reminded herself, standing there at the gates, that she was no longer the frightened girl who had once lived behind these walls. She had a different name now. She had spent years perfecting a way of carrying herself that revealed nothing, learning to mask her scent with a simple mixture of herbs she kept in a small vial around her neck, a habit born from necessity rather than the old trader's charm, which had run out long ago. She had survived alone in human cities far larger and more dangerous than this quiet territory. She could survive one interview for a household position. She took a slow breath, steadied herself, and walked through the gates. A stern woman named Grace met her at the servants' entrance, a tall figure with iron-gray hair pulled back into a tight knot, and eyes that seemed to measure everything they landed on. Grace ran the household staff with clear efficiency, asking Elena a series of practical questions about her experience with cooking, cleaning, and mending, nodding along at each answer without much visible reaction. "You'll start in the East Wing," Grace said finally, closing the small ledger she had been writing in. "Laundry and general cleaning to begin with. If you prove capable, there may be room to move into more specialized duties. The household has grown considerably in the last few years, and we are always short on reliable hands." Elena kept her eyes down and nodded, relief washing through her at the simple fact that Grace had not looked at her twice, had not paused or narrowed her eyes with any flicker of recognition. 5 years had changed her enough, it seemed, at least on the surface. Her hair was longer now, and darker from years without the sun she used to spend hours in as a girl. Her face had thinned with hard work and harder years. She was, she hoped, simply another face among the many that passed through a household this large. "The East Wing," Grace continued, leading her down a long corridor lined with tall windows, houses most of the family's private quarters, along with several guest rooms that are rarely used. "You'll report to me each morning, and you are not, under any circumstances, to enter the private study or the sealed room at the end of the second-floor corridor. Those are not part of your duties." "The sealed room?" Elena asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Grace's expression flickered, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "It belongs to the master of the house. No staff enter it, not even for cleaning. He tends to it himself." Elena said nothing more, though her pulse had quickened at the words, a cold suspicion beginning to form in the back of her mind that she immediately tried to push away. It was a large household, she reminded herself. Powerful families kept all manner of private rooms, studies, records, treasures they preferred to guard themselves. It meant nothing. It could not mean what some small, foolish part of her wanted it to mean. The first days passed in a blur of exhausting, unfamiliar labor. Elena scrubbed floors until her hands cracked in the cold, hauled baskets of laundry between the washing rooms and the drying lines strung across the back courtyard, and learned the rhythms of a household far larger and more complex than any she had worked in during her years of quiet exile. She kept to herself as much as possible, speaking only when spoken to, eating her meals quickly in the corner of the servants' hall while the other staff chattered around her about matters that meant nothing to her. She learned, in fragments overheard between other servants, the shape of the family she now worked for. The manor belonged to a man the staff referred to only as the master, a figure who was spoken of with a mixture of respect and quiet unease. He ran the estate with strict fairness, they said, never cruel, never unreasonable, but distant in a way that seemed to unsettle even those who had served him for years. He rarely smiled. He rarely raised his voice either, which some of the staff seemed to find more unnerving than if he had. He wasn't always like this, an older woman named Rosalind confided to Elena one evening, as they folded linens together in the drying room. "When I first came to work here, near 15 years back now, he was different. Warmer. He used to laugh, if you can believe that. Something happened to him, 5 years or so ago now. Changed him completely. Never talks about it. None of us dare ask." Elena's hands stilled over the linen she was folding, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Rosalind must be able to hear it. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Rosalind shrugged, glancing toward the door as though the walls themselves might be listening. "No one really knows, not for certain. There are stories, of course. Some say he lost someone very dear to him. Some say it was a matter of the pack, politics, and power struggles that ended badly. Whatever it was, it hollowed him out. He keeps that sealed room upstairs, tends to it himself every single night without fail, and no living soul has been permitted inside it in 5 years." Elena forced herself to keep folding the linen in her hands, though her fingers had gone cold and clumsy. 5 years. The same number of years she had spent running, hiding, rebuilding a life from nothing, in towns and cities, far from the territory she had once called home. It could be a coincidence. It could mean nothing at all, and yet the small, insistent voice in the back of her mind refused to be quiet. That night, unable to sleep in the narrow servants' quarters she shared with 2 other women, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning the pieces over in her mind. She told herself repeatedly that there were countless powerful families in the region, countless masters of countless manors, and that the odds of her having wandered directly back into Damien's household were vanishingly small. She told herself this until the words lost all meaning, worn thin by repetition. Still, she could not shake the memory of the gates, the particular curve of the drive, the shape of the old stonework beneath the newer additions. She had spent 2 years of her life inside walls like these. Some part of her, some deep and stubborn instinct, insisted that she already knew the answer to the question she was too afraid to ask directly. The following morning, Grace assigned her to help with cleaning duties in the second-floor corridor of the East Wing, the very hallway that led toward the sealed room she had been warned never to enter. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her cleaning supplies, torn between the overwhelming urge to look and the equally overwhelming fear of what she might find. She worked her way down the long corridor slowly, dusting picture frames and polishing the dark wood paneling that lined the walls, her eyes drifting again and again toward the closed door at the far end, plain and unremarkable, except for the fact that every servant she had spoken to treated it with a kind of hushed reverence usually reserved for sacred places. She had nearly reached the end of the corridor when she heard footsteps approaching from the staircase behind her, heavy and deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone accustomed to commanding attention without needing to raise his voice. Every instinct in her body went still, her wolf senses, dulled as they were from years of suppression, still sharp enough to recognize danger when it approached. She kept her head down, focusing entirely on the picture frame in front of her, praying silently that whoever was approaching would pass by without a second glance, just another servant among many in a household this large. The footsteps slowed as they reached the corridor, then stopped entirely. Elena did not turn around. She could feel eyes on her back, a weight of attention that made the skin along her spine prickle with an awareness she had not felt in 5 long years. She forced her hands to keep moving, dusting the same frame she had already cleaned, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the sound alone might give her away. "You're new," a deep voice said behind her, low and measured, carrying an authority that needed no volume to command a room. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She would have known that voice anywhere, in any lifetime, even after 5 years of trying to forget it. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, the same instinct that had once carried her through a dark forest with torches burning behind her. But there was nowhere to run to now, no ward line to cross, no cover of night to disappear into. She forced herself to turn slowly, keeping her eyes lowered in the practiced manner of a servant, her heart pounding against her ribs as she prepared to face, for the first time in 5 years, the Alpha King she had once fled into the dark to escape. "Yes, sir," Elena said quietly, keeping her gaze fixed somewhere near his boots, her voice pitched lower and rougher than her natural tone, a trick she had practiced for years to disguise herself among strangers. "Started this week. Grace assigned me to the East Wing." She waited, every muscle coiled tight, for some flicker of recognition to cross his face, for the terrible moment when he would say her true name aloud and the careful life she had built over 5 years would come crashing down around her. But Damien only studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes moving over her with the detached assessment of a man checking on the general condition of his household staff. Nothing more. "Make sure you don't disturb the room at the end of the hall," he said finally, his voice flat, carrying none of the warmth she remembered from years ago and none of the suspicion she had feared. "It is not to be touched." "Understood, sir," Elena murmured, and he moved past her without another word, continuing down the corridor toward the sealed door she had been so carefully avoiding. She did not turn to watch him go, though every instinct screamed at her to look, to study the changes 5 years had carved into him, to understand what Rosalind had meant when she said he had been hollowed out. She heard the door open at the end of the hall, then close again, and something in the sound of it, quiet and deliberate, sent a chill through her entire body. She finished her cleaning duties on shaking legs and returned to the servants' quarters that evening, feeling as though she had narrowly survived something far more dangerous than any physical threat she had faced during her years alone. He had not recognized her. The realization should have brought relief, and in some measure it did, but beneath that relief ran a strange, unexpected current of something closer to grief. 5 years apart, and he had looked directly at her, spoken to her, stood close enough to touch her, and seen nothing but an unfamiliar servant girl. Whatever remained of him, whatever grief the other staff whispered about in hushed voices, apparently did not extend to actually recognizing the woman he supposedly mourned when she stood directly in front of him. She told herself this was a good thing. It meant she was safe, at least for now. It meant she could continue working here, earning wages she desperately needed, without fear of discovery. It meant she did not have to face whatever conversation might follow if he ever learned the truth of who she really was. Over the following days, Elena settled cautiously into the rhythm of her new position, growing more confident that her disguise would hold. She saw Damien occasionally around the manor, always from a distance, always careful to keep her head down and her expression neutral whenever their paths crossed. She watched him the way she imagined any curious new servant might watch the master of a large household, though she knew her own curiosity ran far deeper and far more dangerous than simple staff gossip. He was different from the man she remembered, just as Rosalind had said. The Damien she had known 5 years ago had carried his authority easily, tempered always with an underlying warmth that showed itself in small moments. A private joke shared with a trusted guard, patience with servants who made mistakes, genuine interest in the well-being of the people under his protection. The man she watched now moved through his own household like a figure carved from stone, efficient and fair in every visible way, but utterly closed off from anything resembling warmth. She learned, through careful and cautious observation, that he had never taken a mate in the 5 years since her disappearance, despite what the staff described as considerable pressure from the pack elders to secure an heir and stabilize the succession. She learned that he attended only the ceremonies and gatherings that absolutely required his presence, delegating everything else to trusted commanders, while he retreated further into the isolation of his private study. She learned that every single night, without exception, he climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor of the East Wing and disappeared into the sealed room for exactly 1 hour before returning to his own quarters. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest as the days passed, an uncomfortable weight she could not quite set down. She had spent 5 years convincing herself that leaving had been not only necessary but right, that whatever grief he might have felt in the immediate aftermath of her escape would have long since faded into the ordinary business of ruling a powerful territory. She had not expected to find a man who still, after 5 years, visited a room he kept sealed against the entire world, tending to something inside it with a devotion that bordered on ritual. She desperately wanted to know what was inside that room, though she told herself repeatedly that satisfying her curiosity was not worth the risk of discovery. Still, the question gnawed at her during her long hours of labor, distracting her from her duties in ways that earned her a sharp reprimand from Grace when she scorched a set of linens she had left too long over the drying fire. "Keep your mind on your work," Grace told her firmly, though not unkindly, examining the ruined linen with a disapproving frown. "Whatever troubles follow you here, they have no place in this household. We all have our burdens. The work does not stop for them." Elena apologized and promised to do better, chastened by the reminder that she could not afford to draw attention to herself, whether through carelessness or curiosity. She redoubled her efforts to blend seamlessly into the rhythm of the household, arriving early, working diligently, speaking little, and avoiding any situation that might bring her into direct contact with Damien more often than strictly necessary. Despite her best efforts, their paths continued to cross with a frequency that felt almost deliberate, though she reminded herself it was simply the natural result of her duties frequently taking her through the East Wing corridors he favored. Each encounter followed the same pattern, a brief exchange of practical words, his eyes passing over her without any spark of recognition, and Elena retreating afterward, with her heart still pounding from the strain of maintaining her disguise in his direct presence. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into her new position, she found herself alone in the 2nd-floor corridor, tasked with polishing the wood paneling that ran the length of the hall. The manor was unusually quiet, most of the staff occupied with preparations for a gathering of regional pack leaders scheduled for the following week, and Elena worked in solitary silence, her thoughts drifting despite her best efforts to stay focused. She had nearly reached the sealed door at the end of the corridor when she noticed something she had not seen before. A small gap where the door had not been closed completely, left open perhaps an inch by whoever had last entered. Her heart began to pound as she stared at that narrow gap, torn between every instinct telling her to walk away and a curiosity 5 years in the making that refused to be silenced any longer. She told herself she would only look. She would not enter. She would simply satisfy the question that had haunted her since her first day in this household, and then she would close the door and return to her work and never think of it again. She crossed the remaining distance on quiet feet, her pulse roaring in her ears, and gently pushed the door open just wide enough to see inside. The room beyond was smaller than she had expected, and unmistakably, achingly familiar. A narrow bed sat against the far wall, made up with the same pale blue coverlet she remembered choosing herself, years ago, during her first spring in Damien's court. A small writing desk stood beneath the window, scattered with books she recognized, worn copies of stories she had once spent long afternoons reading aloud to him. A simple wooden hairbrush sat on the desk beside them, and a folded dress hung over the back of the chair. Pale yellow fabric she had once worn to a summer festival that felt now like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. Everything in the room had been preserved exactly as she had left it 5 years ago, dusted and cared for with obvious devotion, untouched by time, in a way that made her chest ache with a grief she had not expected to feel. This was not the shrine of a man who had simply lost track of an unwanted guest. This was the careful, deliberate preservation of something Damien had never stopped mourning, tended to every single night for 5 long years. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, tears rising unexpectedly in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden collision of everything she had told herself about her escape, and everything the room in front of her seemed to say instead. She had convinced herself that leaving had cost her everything and cost him nothing, that she alone had carried the weight of those 2 years and their painful ending. Standing in the doorway of this quiet, preserved room, she understood for the first time that she had been wrong. A floorboard creaked somewhere behind her, and Elena spun around, her heart lurching violently in her chest, terrified she would find Damien himself standing in the corridor, having caught her exactly where she had been forbidden to be. Instead, she found Rosalind, standing several feet away with a basket of linens balanced on her hip, her eyes wide with alarm. "You cannot be in there," Rosalind whispered urgently, glancing anxiously toward the staircase. "Close that door now, before someone sees you. If he finds a servant snooping in that room, he will dismiss you on the spot, and count yourself fortunate if that is the worst of it." Elena stepped back quickly, pulling the door closed with trembling hands, her mind still spinning from what she had seen. "I only wanted to see," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion she could not fully explain to a woman who had no idea what the room truly meant. "I did not touch anything." Rosalind studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and slightly suspicious passing behind her eyes, though she said nothing further about it. "Whoever she was," Rosalind said finally, her voice softening slightly, "she must have been someone remarkable, to leave a man like that so thoroughly undone. Come now, before Grace notices we have both gone missing from our duties." Elena followed her down the corridor in silence, her thoughts a tangled storm of grief and guilt, and a fear she had not felt so sharply since the night she first fled these very walls. She had spent 5 years believing she understood the full shape of what she had done by leaving. Standing outside that sealed door, she realized she understood almost nothing at all, and the weight of that realization followed her through the rest of her duties for the remainder of the long, unsettled day. The gathering of regional pack leaders arrived a week later, filling the manor with unfamiliar faces and an undercurrent of tension that even the newest servants could sense in the air. Elena worked longer hours than usual, helping prepare guest quarters and assisting in the kitchens as the household strained to accommodate the sudden influx of powerful visitors, each one arriving with their own retinue of guards and attendants. She kept herself as invisible as possible during those days, carrying trays and folding linens and doing everything within her power to avoid drawing attention from the assembled leaders, several of whom she recognized from her time in Damien's court 5 years earlier. She had been younger then, kept mostly out of sight during official gatherings, but she remembered enough faces to feel a fresh wave of anxiety every time she passed through a room filled with visiting dignitaries. On the second evening of the gathering, as Elena carried a tray of refreshments toward the great hall, she overheard fragments of a tense conversation drifting from a nearby study, the door left slightly ajar. She recognized Damien's voice immediately, low and controlled, though carrying an edge of frustration she had rarely heard from him even in the old days. "The northern territories are testing us," a second voice said, one Elena did not recognize, rough and urgent. "3 border skirmishes in as many weeks. They believe our attention is divided, that we are weaker than we once were." "We are not weaker," Damien replied evenly, though something in his tone suggested even he was not entirely certain of the claim. "But I will not deny that the pack has felt the absence of stability at the top for longer than any of us would like to admit." Elena hurried past the door before she could hear more, her heart pounding, uncertain whether the unease she felt came from the danger implied in the conversation or the strange, unwelcome guilt that twisted through her at the suggestion that her absence had somehow weakened the pack's standing among its rivals. She told herself it was not her responsibility, that Damien was a capable leader who had ruled successfully long before she had ever entered his life, but the thought lingered uncomfortably regardless. The following day brought chaos to the manor in a form no one had anticipated. Elena was in the kitchens, helping prepare the midday meal for the assembled guests, when the sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps echoed through the corridors above. Moments later, one of the household guards burst into the kitchen, his face pale, calling for the healer and anyone with medical training to come immediately to the eastern courtyard. Word spread quickly through the frightened staff that a fight had broken out between rival delegations, tensions from the northern border disputes boiling over into open conflict within the manor's own walls. Elena, along with several other servants, was ordered to assist in bringing supplies and clean linens to the courtyard, where the household healer, an elderly man named Edward, struggled to tend to several wounded guards amid the chaos. She arrived in the courtyard to find a scene of controlled panic, several men bleeding from injuries sustained in the brief but violent clash, Edward moving between them with the harried efficiency of a man who had far too many patients and not nearly enough hands to help him. Elena set down her supplies and, before she could stop herself, years of instinct from her own pack's healer taking over, began helping to clean and bind wounds alongside him. "You have training," Edward observed, glancing at her with surprise as she efficiently stopped the bleeding on a guard's forearm, applying pressure with practiced hands. "A little," Elena admitted, keeping her focus on her work rather than meeting his eyes. "From long ago." Edward did not press further, too occupied with the sheer volume of injuries to spare much attention for questioning a servant who happened to be useful in a crisis. Elena worked for the better part of an hour, moving from patient to patient, her old training resurfacing with a fluency that surprised even herself, until the worst of the immediate injuries had been treated and the courtyard began to quiet. It was in the midst of this quieting chaos that Damien appeared, moving through the courtyard with the barely contained fury of a leader whose household had just been disrupted by exactly the kind of instability his rivals hoped to exploit. He spoke briefly and sharply with the guards involved in the conflict, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the courtyard almost instantly, before his attention turned toward Edward and the remaining wounded. "How bad is it?" he asked, his eyes sweeping over the scene with barely restrained tension. "Manageable," Edward replied, though he sounded exhausted. "No fatal injuries, though several will need close attention over the coming days. I could not have managed the initial response without help." He gestured toward Elena, who froze where she knelt beside a wounded guard, suddenly the unwilling center of attention. "She has training, saved considerable time getting the bleeding under control. Damien's gaze shifted toward Elena, and for one terrible suspended moment, she felt certain the truth would finally surface. That something in the sight of her kneeling in a courtyard with blood on her hands, doing exactly the kind of work she had once done quietly during her years in his court, would trigger the recognition that had somehow eluded him for weeks. "Where did you learn healing?" he asked, his voice quieter now, directed at her alone, though it carried an intensity that made her pulse race. "My old pack," Elena said carefully, keeping her eyes lowered, her voice pitched in the rough, disguised tone she had practiced for years. "Before I lost them. It has been a long time since I needed to use it." Something flickered across his face at her words, brief and unreadable, gone before she could fully interpret it. He studied her for a long moment, longer than the situation strictly required, and Elena forced herself to remain still under his scrutiny, praying silently that whatever suspicion had briefly surfaced in his expression would pass without further comment. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice returning to its usual controlled distance. "Edward, see that she is compensated for her assistance today. Skilled hands are valuable, and today they may have prevented a difficult situation from becoming considerably worse." He turned and left the courtyard as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Elena kneeling beside her patient with her heart still hammering against her ribs, uncertain whether she had narrowly avoided disaster or simply postponed an inevitable reckoning. Edward thanked her warmly for her help, unaware of the storm of emotion churning beneath her calm exterior, and Elena finished her work in the courtyard in a daze, her mind replaying the moment Damien's eyes had lingered on her for just a fraction too long. That evening, exhausted from the long and harrowing day, Elena retreated to the servants' quarters earlier than usual, hoping for a few hours of undisturbed rest before her duties resumed the following morning. She had barely settled onto her narrow bed when Rosalind appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You handled yourself well today," Rosalind said, settling onto the edge of her own bed across the small room. "Edward has not stopped talking about it. Said he has not seen hands that steady with a wound in years, not since before." Well, she hesitated, something careful entering her voice. "Not since before the master's companion disappeared, all those years back. She used to help him too, from what I have heard the older staff say. He trained her himself, apparently, back when he still had the patience for that sort of thing." Elena's breath caught painfully in her chest, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, staring up at the ceiling rather than meeting Rosalind's curious gaze. "I did not know that," she said quietly, which was, in the strictest sense, true, though the words felt like a betrayal all the same. "Strange coincidence, is it not?" Rosalind mused, though there was no real suspicion in her tone, only idle curiosity. "You arriving here with the exact same skill, all these years later. Small world, I suppose?" "Small world?" Elena echoed faintly, and turned onto her side, closing her eyes against the flood of memory and guilt threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent 5 years believing that the careful walls she built around her old life were strong enough to keep the past entirely separate from her present. Standing in that courtyard today, watching Damien's eyes linger on her hands as though searching for something he could not quite name, she understood that those walls were far more fragile than she had allowed herself to believe. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake for hours, listening to Rosalind's quiet breathing across the room, turning over the events of the day again and again in her mind. She thought of Damien's expression in the courtyard, the brief flicker of something unreadable that had crossed his face when he asked about her training. She thought of the sealed room upstairs, preserved exactly as she had left it, tended to every single night for 5 long years. She thought of the words Rosalind had spoken so casually, unaware of how deeply they had struck. Somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, Elena finally admitted to herself what she had been trying to avoid since the moment she first saw the manor's gates rising out of the frost. She was not simply working here out of desperate financial necessity, though that necessity was real enough. Some deeper, more complicated part of her had wanted to see him again, had needed to understand what 5 years of separation had truly cost them both, even as every rational instinct screamed at her that the answer might be more than she could bear to discover. She closed her eyes at last as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the small window of the servants' quarters, exhausted but no closer to peace, aware that the careful distance she had maintained for 5 years was beginning, slowly and inevitably, to crumble. In the days following the courtyard incident, Elena noticed a subtle shift in the way Damien's attention seemed to find her, small and easily dismissed on their own, but accumulating into a pattern she could no longer ignore. He began appearing in corridors she happened to be cleaning, with a frequency that felt far too coincidental for a man who supposedly had an entire estate to oversee. He asked Grace, on more than one occasion, about the new servant assigned to the East Wing, questions Grace relayed back to Elena with mild curiosity, never suspecting the deeper currents running beneath his interest. Elena told herself repeatedly that his attention meant nothing more than a leader's natural curiosity about a servant who had proven unexpectedly useful during a crisis. She told herself this even as her body responded to his presence with a familiarity that unsettled her far more than any suspicion he might have shown, an old instinct that recognized him on some level deeper than conscious thought, the way her pulse quickened whenever his voice carried down a corridor, the way her wolf, dulled as it was from years of suppression, seemed to stir faintly whenever he drew near. One cold afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the gathering of pack leaders had concluded and the manor had settled back into its usual quiet rhythm, Elena found herself alone in the manor's small library, tasked with organizing a collection of books that had been left in disarray following the recent influx of guests. She worked methodically, returning volumes to their proper shelves, when the sound of the door opening behind her made her freeze. "I did not realize anyone was in here," Damien said, his voice carrying the same measured control she had grown accustomed to hearing from him, though something in his tone suggested mild surprise at finding her there. "I was asked to reorganize the shelves, sir," Elena replied, keeping her back to him as she continued her work, hoping he would simply retrieve whatever he had come for and leave without further conversation. "I can return another time if you need the room." "No need," he said, moving further into the library, and Elena heard him settle into one of the reading chairs near the window rather than retreating as she had hoped. "Continue your work. I only came to retrieve a book." She continued organizing the shelves in tense silence, acutely aware of his presence behind her, the weight of his attention pressing against her back like something physical. Several long minutes passed before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, carrying a note of something she could not quite identify. "You remind me of someone," he said finally, and Elena's hands stilled completely on the shelf in front of her, her heart lurching violently in her chest. "I cannot quite place why. Something in the way you move, perhaps. It has been bothering me since the day you arrived." Elena forced herself to keep her breathing steady, her back still turned to him, terrified that whatever expression had crossed her face in that moment would give away everything she had spent 5 years and countless careful precautions trying to hide. "I could not say, sir," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have not been in this territory long." "No," he agreed slowly, and she could hear him rising from the chair, his footsteps moving closer across the library floor. "Neither had she, when I first met her. She came from a pack far from here, lost everything in a conflict that was never properly resolved. I brought her into my court, thinking I was offering her protection." He paused, and Elena felt him stop directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that the careful herbal disguise she wore suddenly felt impossibly thin. "I have wondered often, in the years since, whether what I offered her ever felt like protection at all, or whether it felt like something closer to a cage." Elena's throat tightened painfully, tears rising unexpectedly at the raw honesty in his voice, an honesty she had never once heard from him even during the 2 years they had spent together in his court. She kept her eyes fixed on the shelf in front of her, gripping the edge of it hard enough that her knuckles whitened, terrified that if she turned around now, everything would come rushing out at once. 5 years of careful silence shattered in a single unguarded moment. "I am sure you did what you believed was right, sir," she said quietly, her voice barely steady. "Perhaps," Damien said, and she heard him step back, putting distance between them once more, though his voice remained low and heavy, with something that sounded very much like old grief, given fresh air after years of confinement. "I have had a great deal of time to consider it since she left. 5 years, to be precise. It is remarkable how long a person can hold on to a mistake, turning it over and over, searching for some version of events where the outcome might have been different." He moved toward the door, and Elena finally allowed herself to turn, watching his retreating back, with an ache in her chest so profound it nearly buckled her knees. He paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the doorframe, and for one suspended moment she thought he might turn around, might finally see through the careful disguise she had built over years of hiding. "Finish the shelves whenever you have a moment," he said instead, his voice returning to its usual measured distance. "There is no urgency." He left without looking back, and Elena sank slowly into the reading chair he had vacated, her legs no longer able to support her, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks in the empty silence of the library. She pressed a hand against her mouth to muffle the sound of her own ragged breathing, overwhelmed by the collision of 5 years of carefully maintained distance and the raw, unguarded grief she had just witnessed in a man she had convinced herself no longer truly mourned her. She remained in the library for nearly an hour, composing herself slowly. Before returning to her duties with red-rimmed eyes, she explained away to a concerned Rosalind as simple exhaustion. But the conversation replayed itself relentlessly in her mind over the following days, each word settling deeper into her chest, unsettling the careful narrative she had constructed about her own escape and its consequences. She had told herself, for 5 long years, that leaving had been an act of necessary self-preservation, that whatever pain it caused Damien was simply the unavoidable cost of reclaiming her own freedom after 2 years of gilded captivity. She had not allowed herself to consider, in any real depth, what it might mean that he had spent those same 5 years not moving on, not forgetting, but instead preserving every trace of her presence with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. The guilt of this realization sat uneasily alongside a resurfacing anger she had thought long buried, the memory of 2 years spent as a beautiful, well-guarded prisoner, never once given a genuine choice about her own life, watched and protected and confined in equal measure until escape had felt like the only possible path forward. Both truths existed simultaneously now, tangled together in a way she found impossible to fully untangle, grief for what her leaving had cost him warring constantly against the certainty that she had needed to leave regardless. Nearly a week after the encounter in the library, an unexpected complication arose that forced Elena's careful equilibrium into sudden and dangerous disarray. A traveling merchant arrived at the manor's gates, seeking temporary shelter from an early winter storm, and among his goods, displayed for potential sale to the household, was a small collection of charms and herbal remedies, not unlike the ones Elena had once relied upon during her years of hiding. Grace, always practical in matters of household supplies, invited the merchant to display his wares in the main hall for the staff and family to examine. Elena, tasked with assisting in the preparation of the hall for the merchant's brief visit, found herself standing uncomfortably close to a table covered in exactly the kind of scent masking herbs she herself relied upon daily, worn thin now after years of steady use and increasingly difficult to replace in the small town where she had been living before taking this position. She had nearly finished setting up the display tables when she noticed the merchant watching her with an unusual intensity, his eyes narrowing slightly as though something about her had caught his professional attention. He was, she realized with a sudden lurch of alarm, exactly the sort of traveling trader who might recognize the particular blend of herbs woven into the small vial she wore hidden beneath her collar. the very disguise that had kept her safe for 5 long years. "That is an unusual mixture you carry," the merchant said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only Elena could hear it over the general bustle of the hall. "I have only known one supplier who blends scent-masking herbs in quite that particular way. Strange thing to find on a household servant in a territory like this." Elena's blood ran cold, her mind racing through possible explanations, even as she forced her expression to remain neutral. Before she could formulate a response, she became aware of a shift in the atmosphere of the hall, a sudden quiet that fell over the assembled staff, and she turned to find Damien standing near the entrance, having apparently arrived to inspect the merchant's wares himself, his sharp eyes moving from the merchant's suspicious expression directly to Elena's carefully controlled face. The silence in the hall stretched unbearably as Damien crossed the room toward the merchant's table, his gaze moving between the trader's puzzled expression and Elena's carefully composed face with a sharpness that made her stomach twist into knots. She fought the urge to step back, to flee the hall entirely, forcing herself instead to remain still, her hands folded in front of her, in the posture of a dutiful servant with nothing to hide. "Is there a problem?" Damien asked, his voice even, though Elena could hear the undercurrent of authority beneath the calm words, the tone of a man who expected an honest answer regardless of who stood before him. The merchant hesitated, glancing between Damien and Elena, as though weighing the wisdom of pursuing his earlier observation in front of the household's master. "No trouble, sir," he said finally, his professional instincts apparently overriding his curiosity. "Merely commenting on the young woman's taste in herbal remedies. An old habit of mine, noticing such things. Occupational curiosity, nothing more." Damien's eyes lingered on Elena a moment longer, something calculating passing behind his gaze that made her pulse race with fresh alarm, before he turned his attention fully to the merchant's wares, asking practical questions about the household's winter supply needs. Elena took the opportunity to retreat quietly from the hall, her legs unsteady beneath her, grateful beyond words that the merchant had chosen discretion over further comment. She spent the remainder of the day in a state of quiet, simmering anxiety, certain that her careful disguise had come dangerously close to unraveling entirely. She avoided the main hall for the rest of the merchant's brief stay, taking on additional duties in the far wing of the manor to keep herself as distant as possible from any further scrutiny. That evening, as she prepared for bed in the servants' quarters, a soft knock came at the door, and Elena opened it to find one of the younger household guards standing in the corridor, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone delivering a message he did not fully understand himself. "The master requests your presence in his study," the guard said. "Now, if you are able." Elena's heart plummeted, every fear she had carried throughout the day crystallizing into sudden, sharp terror. She thanked the guard with a steadiness she did not feel, and followed him through the quiet, darkened corridors of the manor toward Damien's private study, her mind racing through every possible explanation she might offer, every excuse that might satisfy whatever suspicion had prompted this summons. The guard left her at the study door, and Elena knocked softly before entering at Damien's low command to come in. She found him standing near the window, his back to the door, the room lit only by a single lamp and the dying embers of a fire in the hearth. He did not turn immediately, and Elena stood just inside the doorway, waiting, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. "Close the door," he said finally, and she did, the soft click of the latch sounding unbearably loud in the tense silence of the room. "You wish to see me, sir," Elena said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. Damien turned slowly to face her, and something in his expression made her breath catch, an intensity in his golden eyes that reminded her, painfully, of the way he used to look at her years ago, before everything had changed. "The merchant recognized your herbs," he said quietly. "A particular blend, used specifically to mask a wolf's natural scent from other wolves. It is not a common mixture. Most servants in my household have no need for such a thing." Elena's mind raced desperately for an explanation, But before she could offer one, Damien continued, his voice growing quieter still, almost gentle, in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. "I have spent 5 years," he said, "learning to recognize every possible way a person might try to hide themselves from me. I have hunted rogue wolves who used exactly this kind of disguise. I know the scent beneath the herbs, if I look closely enough, if I allow myself to actually search for it, rather than simply accepting what I am told to see." He took a slow step toward her, and Elena felt rooted to the spot, unable to retreat, unable to speak. "I did not allow myself to search closely enough these past weeks. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief had simply made me see her in every face that reminded me even faintly of what I lost. It was easier to believe that than to consider the alternative." "Sir, I do not understand what you mean," Elena managed, though her voice betrayed her, cracking on the final word. "Do not," Damien said, and for the first time, something raw and dangerous edged into his controlled voice. "Do not stand in my study and lie to me again. I have had 5 years of lies from everyone around me, comforting words meant to ease my grief, assurances that I would eventually move past what happened. I do not have the patience left for another lie, least of all from you." The room fell silent, the weight of his final words settling over Elena like a physical force. She felt the careful walls she had maintained for 5 years beginning to crack under the pressure of his gaze, under the raw honesty in his voice, under the sheer exhaustion of maintaining a disguise that had clearly already failed in every way that mattered. "How long have you known?" she whispered finally, abandoning the pretense entirely, her disguised voice slipping back into its natural register for the first time in weeks. Something shifted visibly in Damien's expression at the sound of her true voice, a mixture of vindication and devastation crossing his features in quick succession. "I did not know," he said quietly. "Not with certainty. Not until this moment. I suspected. I have suspected for weeks, ever since the courtyard, ever since I watched your hands work a wound with the exact same steadiness I remember teaching you myself. I told myself I was imagining it, because the alternative felt impossible to bear." Elena felt tears rising, hot and unstoppable, spilling down her cheeks as 5 years of careful distance finally collapsed entirely. "I did not come here to find you," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, I did not know this manor belonged to you until I was already standing at the gates. I needed work. I needed to survive the winter. I did not intend for any of this to happen." "And yet here you stand," Damien said, his voice thick with an emotion he seemed to be struggling to contain. 5 years after you vanished into the forest without a single word of explanation, working in my own household under a disguise so thorough I nearly failed to recognize the woman I have mourned every single night since." "I had reasons for leaving," Elena said, some of her old defiance resurfacing beneath the grief. "Reasons you never once tried to understand, not in 2 years of keeping me behind your walls." "Then explain them to me now," Damien said, closing the remaining distance between them until he stood only a few feet away, close enough that Elena could see every line of exhaustion and grief carved into his face over the past 5 years. "I have waited 5 years for an explanation. I have preserved a room exactly as you left it, hoping against every rational instinct that you might someday return to it. I think I have earned the right to finally hear the truth, whatever it costs either of us to say it aloud." Elena stood frozen before him, the weight of 5 years of careful silence pressing against her chest, aware that the moment she had feared and half hoped for since the day she first saw the manor's gates had finally, unavoidably arrived. She had spent years preparing herself for the possibility of discovery, rehearsing explanations she thought might satisfy the accusations she imagined he would hurl at her. She had never once prepared herself for the raw grief in his voice, the exhausted honesty of a man who had spent 5 years mourning rather than raging, and she found, standing before him now, that every careful explanation she had once rehearsed had abandoned her completely, leaving only the difficult, unguarded truth. You ask why I left, Elena began slowly, forcing herself to hold his gaze, even as every instinct urged her to look away. But I do not think you ever truly asked yourself what those 2 years looked like from where I stood. You gave me silk dresses, and warm rooms, and more comfort than most people ever know in a lifetime. But you never once gave me a choice. I could not walk beyond your gates without an escort. I could not visit the villages without 3 guards trailing behind me. I could not even choose my own meals some days, because your stewards decided what was fitting for the king's companion to eat in public. Damien's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and Elena continued, the words spilling out now with a momentum she could no longer control after 5 years of holding them back. I understood why at first, she said. My own pack had just been destroyed. I had nowhere else to go, and you offered me protection when I had nothing and no one. I was grateful for that, truly. But gratitude does not erase 2 years of feeling like a beautiful object kept safe behind glass, admired by everyone, consulted by no one, least of all about the shape of my own life. I began to feel less like your companion and more like a treasure you had claimed and intended to keep forever, regardless of whether I wished to stay. I never once considered you an object, Damien said quietly, though there was no anger in his voice now, only a kind of stricken understanding beginning to dawn. I considered you the single most important person in my life. I did not know how to protect that without also, apparently, confining it. That is precisely the problem, Elena said, her voice softening slightly despite herself. You could not tell the difference between protecting me and controlling my life, and I do not believe, even now, that you fully understand why those 2 things are not the same. I tried to speak with you about it, more than once. Do you remember? Damien's expression flickered with something like painful recognition. I remember you asking for more freedom to move through the territory unescorted, he said slowly. I remember telling you the danger was too great, that too many rival packs would love nothing more than to use you against me. And I remember believing you, Elena said, for a long time, until I began to understand that the danger you spoke of was real, but it was also convenient. It kept me exactly where you wanted me, dependent entirely on your protection, with no path toward any life of my own outside the walls of your court. I loved you, Damien. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think you have spent 5 years assuming I left because I stopped caring for you, and that was never the truth of it. His breath caught audibly at her words, and for a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at her as though trying to reconcile 5 years of grief with the sudden, unexpected admission she had just offered him. Then why? He asked finally, his voice rough. Why leave at all, if you loved me? Why choose a life of hardship and hiding over everything I offered you? Because loving you was never the question, Elena said, tears rising again despite her efforts to remain composed. The question was whether I could continue existing as a person with no agency of my own, no matter how much comfort surrounded that existence. I needed to know that I could survive on my own terms, make my own choices, build a life that belonged to me rather than one shaped entirely around your protection of me. I could not discover that answer while living behind your walls, watched every hour of every day, however gently that watching was done. Damien was silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the floor between them, and when he finally looked up again, something in his expression had shifted, the raw grief giving way slowly to a kind of painful, dawning comprehension. I built that room upstairs, he said quietly, because I could not accept that you had simply chosen to leave everything I offered you. I told myself something must have happened to you, that you had been taken or harmed, because the alternative, that you had simply needed to escape the life I built around you, felt like an accusation I was not prepared to face. It was not an accusation, Elena said softly. It was survival. I did not leave to punish you, Damien. I left because I could no longer breathe inside a life that had been built entirely by someone else's hands, however loving those hands might have been. And these 5 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper now, did you find what you were searching for? The life that belonged to you alone? Elena considered the question carefully, thinking of the exhausting years of hard labor, the constant fear of discovery, the profound loneliness of building a life with no roots and no permanence, always ready to flee at the first sign of danger. I found pieces of it, she admitted. I learned that I could survive entirely on my own, that I was capable of far more than I ever believed possible while living inside your walls. But I will not pretend those years were easy, or that I never once wondered whether I had made the right choice. And now? Damien asked, taking a slow step closer, close enough that Elena could feel the warmth of him again, achingly familiar despite 5 years of separation. Now that you find yourself here, in my household once more, do you still believe leaving was the right choice? Elena hesitated, torn between the hard-won independence of the past 5 years and the overwhelming pull of standing once again in the presence of the man she had never truly stopped loving, however much she had tried to convince herself otherwise. I believe, she said slowly, choosing her words with care, that I needed those 5 years, regardless of how difficult they were. I needed to know who I was without you, before I could ever consider who I might become with you again. Then what do you need now? Damien asked, his voice low, carrying a vulnerability she had rarely heard from him even during their 2 years together. Because I cannot promise you I know how to give you the freedom you needed 5 years ago, not without learning it properly first. But I can promise you I am willing to learn, if you are willing to teach me, and if there remains any part of you that wants to stay long enough to try. Elena felt the careful walls around her heart, built and reinforced over 5 long years of solitary survival, beginning to soften despite every instinct telling her to remain cautious. She studied his face in the dim light of the study, searching for some trace of the controlling grip she remembered from their years together, and found instead only exhaustion and honest, unguarded hope, the expression of a man who had spent 5 years learning the cost of his own mistakes and now stood ready, however imperfectly, to try correcting them. I do not know what I need yet, she admitted honestly, but I am no longer running from you, Damien. I think that alone is worth acknowledging, after everything. A ghost of something like relief passed across his face, though he did not press her further, seeming to understand instinctively that pushing too hard now would only undo whatever fragile ground they had just begun to rebuild between them. Then perhaps, he said quietly, we simply begin there and allow whatever comes next to unfold in its own time, without either of us forcing it into a shape it is not ready to take. Elena nodded slowly, wiping the last of her tears away, aware that this conversation, difficult and raw as it had been, marked only the beginning of a far longer reckoning that still lay ahead of them both. Whatever came next, she understood now, would require more honesty and more patience from them both than either had shown during their first 2 years together, and she was no longer certain, standing in the quiet study with the dying fire casting soft shadows across the room, whether she was ready for what that honesty might eventually demand of her. News of Elena's true identity did not remain contained within the walls of Damien's private study for long. Within days, whispers began circulating among the household staff, carried by half-glimpsed moments and overheard fragments of conversation, until Grace herself approached Elena privately to confirm what half the household had already begun to suspect. Elena did not deny it, too exhausted from the weight of 5 years of hiding to continue the pretense any further within these walls, and Grace, to her considerable relief, responded with quiet understanding rather than judgment. I wondered, Grace admitted, studying Elena with new eyes in the small linen room where she had drawn her aside. Something about the way you carried yourself never quite matched an ordinary servant. I am glad, for his sake, that whatever happened between you has found some resolution. He has not been himself in a very long time. The relative privacy Elena had maintained during her weeks in the household dissolved almost entirely after that conversation, replaced by a new, unfamiliar visibility that unsettled her nearly as much as the discovery itself had. She continued her duties out of habit and a stubborn refusal to be treated differently, though Damien made it clear, through quiet conversations with Grace that Elena was no longer expected to perform the demanding labor of an ordinary household servant. Elena resisted this shift at first, insisting she preferred to continue earning her own keep through honest work rather than slipping back into a life defined entirely by Damien's provision, a echo of the very dynamic that had driven her away 5 years earlier. Damien, to his credit, did not argue the point, though Elena noticed him watching her with a careful attentiveness that suggested he was working hard to respect the boundary, even when every instinct urged him toward old patterns of protection. Their relationship, in the weeks that followed the revelation, developed slowly and cautiously, built through quiet conversations in the library during her free hours, walks through the manor's gardens, where Elena finally allowed herself to speak openly about the difficult years of her exile, and Damien, in turn, shared the painful details of his own 5 years of grief and slowly hardening isolation. They were, both of them, learning an entirely different way of relating to one another, built on honesty rather than the careful protection and unspoken expectation that had defined their earlier years together. It was into this fragile, rebuilding peace that danger arrived, swift and unexpected, in the form of a messenger who rode hard into the manor's courtyard late one evening, his horse lathered with sweat, carrying urgent news from the northern border territories that had been testing Damien's authority for months. A coordinated attack, the messenger reported breathlessly, as Damien gathered his commanders in the Great Hall to hear the news firsthand. 3 border outposts struck simultaneously at dawn. The Northern Alliance believes they have found the weakness they have been searching for, sir. They are moving toward the Central Territories even now, testing how far they can push before we respond with full force. The manor erupted into controlled chaos as Damien's commanders began organizing a swift response, gathering warriors and supplies for what promised to be a difficult and dangerous campaign against a coalition that had clearly been planning this coordinated strike for some time. Elena watched from the edges of the Great Hall as Damien transformed before her eyes, the careful, vulnerable man she had spoken with in quiet gardens giving way once more to the commanding Alpha King, the pack required in times of genuine crisis. That night, as the household prepared for Damien's imminent departure toward the northern border, Elena found him alone in his study once more, studying maps of the contested territory with an intensity that reminded her painfully of the distant, closed-off man she had first encountered upon her return to the manor. "You do not have to fight this battle personally," Elena said quietly from the doorway, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "You have capable commanders who could lead this campaign in your place." "They could," Damien agreed, not looking up from the maps spread across his desk. "But a coordinated attack of this scale demands the Alpha King's personal response, or every rival territory within striking distance will read my absence as weakness. I cannot afford that perception, not after everything the pack has already endured these past 5 years." Elena crossed the room slowly, studying the maps alongside him, old instincts from her years observing pack politics resurfacing despite her long absence from this world. "Then let me come with you," she said, the words surprising even herself as she spoke them. "I have healing training. You will need capable hands tending to the wounded, and I would rather stand beside you in danger than wait behind these walls wondering whether you will return." Damien's head lifted sharply at her offer, something complicated crossing his features, torn between the old protective instinct that had once driven him to keep her sheltered behind every possible wall, and a newer, harder one understanding that Elena was no longer the frightened girl he had once tried so desperately to protect. "It will be dangerous," he said slowly, testing the words carefully. "I cannot promise your safety on a battlefield. However far back from the fighting, the healers are typically kept." "I am aware of the danger," Elena said firmly. "I survived 5 years entirely on my own, Damien. I am not asking your permission. I am telling you my intention, and asking whether you will trust me enough to let me stand beside you rather than locking me safely away behind these walls while you face this alone." Something shifted visibly in his expression at her words. An old lesson finally, painfully absorbed after 5 years of grief had taught him what 2 years of gentle confinement never had. "Then come," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion that mixed pride and fear in equal measure. "Not because I am granting you permission, but because I understand now that the choice was always yours to make, whether I liked the answer or not." They departed for the northern border 2 days later, alongside a substantial force of Damien's most trusted warriors, Elena riding among the healers assigned to the campaign, her old training resurfacing with each passing mile as she reviewed supplies and prepared herself mentally for whatever violence lay ahead. The journey north took the better part of 3 days, tension building steadily among the traveling company as they drew closer to the contested territories where the Northern Alliance had already claimed several small victories against Damien's border outposts. They arrived to find the situation more precarious than the initial reports had suggested, the Northern Alliance having pressed their advantage further than anyone anticipated, claiming territory that had belonged to Damien's pack for generations. The following days blurred together in a haze of tense negotiations, strategic repositioning, and, eventually, a fierce confrontation between the two forces that tested every ounce of skill and courage the assembled warriors possessed. Elena worked tirelessly among the wounded during the worst of the fighting, her hands steady even as chaos raged not far from the healers' encampment. Old training and 5 years of independent resilience combining into a competence that earned her the respect of warriors who had initially questioned why the Alpha King had brought a former companion along on a dangerous military campaign. She lost herself in the demanding, focused work of tending injuries, grateful for the way it kept her mind from dwelling too long on the danger Damien faced on the front lines of the confrontation. When word finally reached the healers' encampment that Damien had been wounded during a critical moment of the fighting, struck by a rival Alpha's claws during a direct confrontation that had ultimately turned the tide of the battle in their favor, Elena abandoned every careful professional distance she had maintained throughout the campaign and ran toward the front lines herself, terror overriding every instinct toward caution that 5 years of careful survival had taught her. Elena found him near the edge of the battlefield, surrounded by several of his commanders, blood soaking through the torn fabric of his shirt where the rival Alpha's claws had raked deep across his side. He remained conscious, though his face had gone pale beneath the exertion of the fight, and his breathing came ragged as his commanders worked to stem the bleeding while awaiting the healer's arrival. "Move aside," Elena commanded, dropping to her knees beside him with an authority that surprised even the seasoned warriors surrounding them, her hands already reaching for the supplies she had carried from the encampment. The commanders parted without hesitation, something in her focused urgency commanding immediate obedience despite her unofficial status among the traveling company. "You should not be here," Damien managed, a weak attempt at his usual controlled tone, undermined entirely by the pain evident in his voice. "The fighting is not yet fully contained. And you should not have thrown yourself directly into a confrontation with an enemy Alpha without proper support." Elena shot back, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed the depth of his wounds, relief flooding through her when she determined the injuries, while serious, had not struck anything vital. "Hold still. This will hurt considerably before it begins to feel better." She worked with steady, focused hands, cleaning and binding the deep wounds across his side while he gritted his teeth against the pain, his commanders standing watch nearby, providing cover while the remaining pockets of resistance from the Northern Alliance were slowly subdued by the rest of the company. Elena's own wolf, dulled from years of suppression, stirred faintly beneath her skin, some old instinct responding to the sight of her mate wounded and vulnerable. A word she had not allowed herself to consciously acknowledge in 5 long years, suddenly surfacing unbidden in her racing thoughts. "The battle," Damien said through gritted teeth, even as Elena continued her careful work. "How does it stand?" "Your commanders report the Northern Alliance is retreating," Elena said, glancing briefly toward one of the warriors who had just returned from the front lines with fresh news. "They underestimated how quickly your forces would regroup after your injury." It seems your presence alone, wounded or not, was enough to rally the remaining warriors to push back the final assault. Relief passed visibly across Damien's face, though it was quickly overtaken by a fresh wave of pain as Elena finished binding the deepest of his wounds, her hands finally steadying as the immediate crisis began to ease. "You should not have come here," he said again, though the words carried less conviction now, his exhausted eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with the pain of his injuries. "And yet I am glad that I did," Elena replied softly, sitting back on her heels once the worst of the bleeding had been controlled. Studying his pale face with an ache in her chest, she no longer tried to deny. "I could not have borne waiting behind those walls, wondering whether you would return to me. I understand now, in a way I did not fully understand before, why you found it so difficult to let me out of your sight all those years ago. It is a terrible feeling, watching someone you love walk into danger, uncertain whether you will ever see them again." Damien's expression softened despite his obvious exhaustion, one hand reaching weakly to catch hers where it rested against his uninjured side. "The difference," he said quietly, "is that I never gave you the choice to walk into that danger yourself, however capable you might have been. You made that choice today, freely, and I find I can bear the fear of it far better knowing it was yours to make." Elena felt tears rising once more, though these carried none of the grief that had marked so many of her tears over the past 5 years, something warmer and more hopeful threading through them instead. "We have both learned difficult lessons," she said softly. "These past 5 years, apart and now, it seems, together again. I do not know what comes next for us, Damien, but I find I no longer wish to face that uncertainty from a distance." The remainder of the northern campaign concluded within days, the Alliance's forces retreating fully, once word spread of Damien's decisive victory despite his injuries. The coordinated attack that had threatened to destabilize the Pact's authority for months, finally, thoroughly repelled. The journey back to the manor passed in a different atmosphere than the tense ride north had carried, warriors celebrating their hard-won victory even as they nursed their wounds, and Elena rode close beside Damien's litter for much of the journey, tending his recovery with the same steady care she had shown throughout the campaign. Word of the healer who had ridden into a battlefield to save the wounded Alpha King spread quickly through the returning company, and by the time they reached the manor's gates, the story had already begun transforming into something closer to legend among the warriors who had witnessed her courage firsthand. Elena found herself regarded with a new respect among the household staff and pack warriors alike, no longer simply the mysterious servant who had once vanished from Damien's court, but a woman who had proven, through action rather than mere words, the depth of her commitment to the pack she had once fled. Damien's recovery progressed steadily over the following weeks, Elena remaining close throughout his convalescence, their earlier conversations in the library and garden now deepening into something far more settled and certain than the cautious rebuilding they had attempted before the northern campaign had interrupted their fragile peace. The urgency of nearly losing him on that battlefield had stripped away whatever remaining hesitation either of them had carried into their reunion, leaving behind a clarity neither had expected to find so soon. "I have been thinking," Damien said one quiet evening as Elena helped change the dressing on his healing wound, the worst of the danger now safely behind them, "about the room upstairs, the one I have kept sealed for 5 years. Elena's hands paused briefly in their work, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I do not believe I need to keep it sealed any longer," he said quietly. "Not as a shrine to something I lost, at least. Perhaps, if you are willing, it might become something different instead. A room that belongs to you now, in truth, rather than a memorial to a version of you that existed only in my grief." Elena felt her chest tighten with an emotion too complex to name easily. Gratitude and hope and lingering caution all tangled together as she considered his words. "I would like that," she said finally, "though I think, if we are both truly starting fresh, I would prefer we build something new together rather than simply reclaiming what was left behind. The woman who lived in that room 5 years ago no longer exists entirely. Damien. I am not certain I want to step back into her life exactly as it was. Damien nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression. Then we will build something new, he agreed. Whatever shape that takes, I find I am no longer interested in recreating the past. I would rather earn whatever future we build together, one honest choice at a time, than assume I am owed anything simply because of what we once shared. Elena finished securing the fresh dressing and sat back, studying his face in the warm evening light filtering through his study window, allowing herself, for the first time in 5 long years, to imagine a future that did not require constant vigilance, constant readiness to flee at the first sign of danger. The road that had brought her back to this manor had been longer and more difficult than she could have anticipated when she first fled through the dark forest all those years ago, but standing now on the other side of that long journey, she found herself grateful, however cautiously, for every difficult step that had led her here. Winter settled fully over the territory in the weeks that followed, blanketing the manor grounds in deep snow, while Damien's wounds finished healing, and the household slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms after the disruption of the northern campaign. Elena found herself, almost without noticing the transition, occupying an increasingly uncertain position within the household, no longer quite a servant, though not yet publicly acknowledged as anything more definite either. Grace approached the matter with characteristic practicality one morning, finding Elena in the kitchen garden gathering the last of the season's hardy herbs before the deepest cold set in. "The staff have questions," Grace said without preamble, settling onto a nearby bench despite the chill in the air. "Not unkind ones, understand, but questions all the same. Are you remaining as household staff, or has your position within this house changed in ways that require different arrangements?" Elena straightened from her work, considering the question carefully. She had spent the recent weeks in a comfortable but undefined limbo, spending her days partly in continued household duties and partly at Damien's side as his recovery progressed, without either of them having addressed directly what her long-term place within the manor might actually become. "I do not fully know yet," Elena admitted honestly. "Perhaps it is time I found out." That evening, she raised the matter with Damien directly, finding him in his study reviewing correspondence that had accumulated during his convalescence, the pack's ordinary business slowly resuming its usual demands on his attention. "Grace tells me the staff are curious about my position here," Elena said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I confess I am curious myself. We have spoken of building something new together, but we have not spoken of what that actually means, in practical terms, for the life we intend to build." Damien set aside the papers he had been reviewing, giving her his full attention with the seriousness the question clearly deserved. "What would you want it to mean?" he asked, turning the question back to her, with a carefulness that reflected everything he had learned over these past difficult months. "I do not wish to assume anything on your behalf, Elena. Whatever answer you give, I intend to honor it." Elena considered the question for a long moment, weighing 5 years of hard-won independence against the deep, undeniable pull she felt toward the life and the man before her, understanding now that these two things did not have to exist in permanent opposition to one another, as she had once feared. "I do not wish to simply resume the role I once held here," she said slowly. "Not as your companion in the old sense, kept and protected but never truly free. But I also do not wish to remain merely a servant in this household, pretending the last several months never happened, pretending we are strangers to one another." "Then tell me what you do wish for," Damien said quietly, "and we will find a way to build it together." "I wish to stand beside you as an equal," Elena said finally, the words settling into certainty as she spoke them aloud. "Not confined behind these walls, but also not separate from the life and the responsibilities that come with ruling this territory. I have skills now that I did not have 5 years ago, skills I earned through hard experience rather than privilege. I would like to use them, properly, within this household and this pack, rather than simply existing here as an ornament to your court." Damien rose from his desk and crossed the room to kneel before her chair, an act of deference Elena had never once witnessed from him during their earlier years together, when his role as Alpha King had seemed to demand a certain unyielding authority even in private moments. "Then let it be so," he said, taking her hands in his. "Let the pack know you as the healer who rode into battle to save my life, as capable and respected as any warrior or commander within these walls. Let them know you as my equal, in every sense of the word, rather than simply my companion or my regret." "And the room upstairs?" Elena asked softly. "Whatever you wish it to become," Damien said. "A healer's study, perhaps, stocked with the supplies you need to properly tend the pack's wounded, or simply your own private space, separate from mine, for as long as you need that separation, to feel like your own life, rather than an extension of mine. The choice remains entirely yours." Elena felt something settle deep within her chest at his words, a peace she had not expected to find so completely, after 5 years of careful, guarded survival. She thought of the frightened girl who had once fled through a dark forest, certain that freedom and love could not coexist within the same life, and she thought of the exhausted, careful man who had spent 5 years learning, through painful grief, the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. Both of them had traveled long, difficult roads to arrive at this quiet study on a winter evening, and both of them, she understood now, had needed every step of that difficult journey to become the people capable of building something genuinely new together. In the months that followed, Elena's position within the household transformed gradually, but unmistakably, her skills as a healer earning her genuine respect throughout the pack, her voice carrying real weight in matters that affected the territory's well-being. She established a proper healer's study in the room that had once served as a shrine to grief, filling it with supplies and books of her own choosing, a space that belonged entirely to her rather than existing as a monument to a version of herself that no longer fit who she had become. Her relationship with Damien deepened slowly and deliberately, built now on the foundation of hard-won honesty, rather than the gentle, well-intentioned confinement that had once driven her away. They argued, sometimes, over matters both small and significant, and Elena found, to her quiet relief, that Damien no longer retreated into distant authority during these disagreements, but instead engaged with her directly, treating her perspective as worthy of genuine consideration, rather than something to be gently managed and set aside. When spring finally arrived, melting the deep snow that had blanketed the territory throughout the difficult winter months, Damien called a gathering of the full pack, warriors and household staff and regional leaders alike assembling in the great hall to hear an announcement that had, by then, become something of an open secret throughout the household. He spoke of the woman who had once fled his court seeking a freedom he had failed to understand, who had survived 5 years entirely on her own strength, and who had returned not as the frightened girl he remembered, but as a woman capable of standing as his true equal, in partnership rather than possession. Elena stood beside him as he spoke, no longer hiding behind disguised scents or lowered eyes, present fully as herself for the first time within these walls in more than 5 years. She thought, listening to his words carried across the crowded hall, of the long road that had brought her back to this place, through forests and human cities, and years of careful, solitary survival, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she had finally arrived exactly where she was meant to be, not because circumstance had returned her here, but because she herself, freely and completely, had chosen to stay. The pack that had once known her only as a mysterious, sheltered companion now knew her as something far more substantial, a healer who had proven her courage on a battlefield, a woman who had rebuilt her own life from nothing and returned to claim her place not as a possession reclaimed, but as a partner freely chosen. And Damien, the Alpha King who had spent 5 long years mourning a loss he never fully understood, stood beside her now having learned, through hard experience and painful patience, exactly what it meant to love someone enough to finally, completely, let them choose their own path, even when that choice led them, in the end, back to him.